I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey Lurkers, welcome to episode 45. Coming up in a couple of days, we have that very special holiday. Yes, I'm talking about Valentine's Day. So what better way to celebrate the Day of Love than to talk about mobsters, murder, and the macabre associated with them? Today we're going to be talking about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre that happened in 1929 in Chicago. This story also has some ghosts associated with it, so we have true crime and some paranormal all mixed together. There's not a better bouquet out there, let me tell you. So we're just going to jump right in. The year, as I said, is 1929, and at this point we're about 9 years into Prohibition. Prohibition was the time between 1920 and 1933, where it was against the law to manufacture and sell alcohol in the United States. 1929 was also the year of the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression, but that all started in October, and this event happened in February, so it's still several months before the market crash. During this time, Chicago was one of the largest centers for gang activity in the country. I don't think that's really changed a whole lot. Sorry, Chicago. Prohibition led to a rise in bootlegging alcohol, and that gave gangs a great way to make money and connections. In Chicago in 1929, there are two gangs of note. One is the South Side Gang, run by infamous mobster Al Capone, also known as Scarface, and his main rival, the North Side Gang, run by George "Bugs" Moran. The South Side Gang was Italian, the North Side Irish, in case you were interested. Is anybody else surprised that they couldn't be more original with the gang names back then? They all have these crazy mobster nicknames, but they call themselves the North Side and the South Side gangs. I just think that's weird. And I'm not gonna lie, but I'm really trying hard not to sing "When you're a jet all the way from your first cigarette to your last dying day, boom boom boom" from West Side Story. I'm sorry. I apologize. Not really. If I have to listen to it in my head, you're going to listen to me sing it. That's just the way it's going to be. By the way, George "Bugs" Moran got his nickname because he was pretty crazy, not because he had bugs. He might have had bugs, I don't really know, but that wasn't the reason behind his nickname. And it just occurred to me that Bugs Bunny was probably named Bugs because he was crazy. I just looked it up and it's true. The name Bugs or Bugsy is an old-fashioned nickname that means crazy or loopy. I think everybody should just call me Jamie Bugsy Jackson. I think that should be my new nickname. So I'm gonna move on. We're gonna get back to the story and I'll stop going off on these crazy tangents. These two particular gangs, the North Side Gang and the South Side Gang, they had been at odds for years. There were some who claimed that because Bugs Moran was a devout Catholic, he had some serious issues with Capone being involved with prostitution. Either way, it was no secret that Moran despised Capone and mockingly referred to Capone as the Beast. Capone felt Bugs Moran was the only thing standing in his way of his desire to dominate over all gang activity in the entire city of Chicago. Bugs Moran had hijacked Capone's shipments, killed his allies, and was a business competitor. In 1926, Bugs Moran had had enough of Capone and escalated the conflict when he and his men drove by a hotel where Capone and his men were eating and sprayed the building with more than 1,000 bullets. Somehow, Capone wasn't hit and he walked away completely uninjured. Then Capone learned that Bugs had put a $50,000 bounty on his head, and Capone allegedly decided enough was enough and he was going to strike first. By 1929, the rivalry had reached its boiling point. Someone called Bugs Moran on February 13th, offering him a special shipment of alcohol from Canada at a discounted price, and the delivery was arranged to happen on the following day, February 14th, at 10:30 a.m. at the warehouse Moran operated at 2122 North Clark Street. So on the morning of February 14th, 1929, which was a Thursday, members of Moran's gang arrived at the warehouse to get ready to receive the shipment. At 10:30 a.m., a police car and a 1928 green and black Cadillac sedan pull up at the warehouse. Two men got out of the police car dressed in police uniforms. Two other men got out of the Cadillac and were wearing suits and ties. The driver was dressed in an expensive chinchilla and gray fedora. The four men waited outside the warehouse for a signal. There were 6 men in the warehouse at that time. Adam Heyer, alias Frank Snyder, alias Hayes, who was the owner of the SMC Cartage Company where the massacre took place. Pete Goosenberg, a 27-year criminal and one of the leaders of Moran's North Side gang. Frank Goosenberg, brother to Pete. John May, who was the father of 7 children and a former safe blower. James Clark, brother-in-law to George Moran, and someone who had a reputation as a hardened killer, and Dr. Reinhard H. Schwimmer, who was an optometrist with offices in the Capitol building. Dr. Schwimmer had no criminal record, but he was known as the companion of hoodlums and was said to have boasted recently that he was in the alky racket and could have anyone taken for a ride. Alky is such a weird word. Alky is short for alcohol, for any of you who aren't aware of that. I'm pretty sure my grandmother taught me that word. I'm pretty sure she used that word to refer to somebody who drank a lot. I'm pretty sure she was like, so-and-so's an alky. I know this. I know that's where I learned that word from. It's an old-fashioned word. I know it from my grandmother. God love her. Anyway, in addition to the 6 men that were in the building at that time, there was also a German Shepherd dog named Highball, who belonged to John May, a former safecracker. I'm going to throw my grandmother in here again. Her favorite drink, she told me, was a Highball. They taste awful. I just thought I'd share. All of the men were members of Moran's gang except Schwimmer, who just thought it was cool to hang out with mobsters. When Al Weinshank, who was owner of the Alcazar Club and a Moran associate, entered the warehouse, the 4 men waiting outside, the 2 of them were dressed as cops, they were signaled and they went inside. It's believed that Weinshank was misidentified as George Bugs Moran. No one can really say exactly what happened inside the warehouse that day, because everybody's dead except for the people who did it. What we do know is that the 7 men were lined up against the wall, their backs to the intruders. The 7 men probably thought this was just another police raid, and they probably weren't overly alarmed. Then the 4 strangers raised their guns and opened fire. They had Thompson submachine guns, or Tommy guns as they're commonly called, a 12-gauge shotgun, and a revolver. Moran's men were sprayed with bullets. There were around 90 rounds. When it was done, 6 men were dead. Adam Heyer, Pete Goosenberg, John May, Al Weinshank, James Clark, and Dr. Reinhard H. Schwimmer. Frank Goosenberg was mortally wounded, but still alive. For those concerned, Highball the German Shepherd was later found tied to a car bumper, and he was completely fine and unharmed. After those 4 strangers gunned down Moran's men in the warehouse, the 2 men dressed as police officers handcuffed their accomplices, who were in civilian clothes, and put them in the back of the police car. They then sped off in the police car with the lights and siren going, giving witnesses the idea that police were taking care of things. George Bugs Moran, who was most likely the intended target, was not inside the building. He had slept in that morning, and he was actually on his way to the warehouse when he saw the 2 men dressed as cops and left. Moran ended up going to get a coffee, ran into another associate, and told him to steer clear of the warehouse, that it was getting raided. He had no idea what was really happening inside. The actual cops didn't show up for 3 hours after the massacre, because witnesses thought the cops and cop car they saw meant police were already on the scene taking care of everything. Apparently it was Highball the dog that finally drew someone's attention because of his constant barking. A man and a woman went to check to see why the dog was carrying on so much without someone tending to it, and they discovered the grisly scene. When the real cops arrived, they found Frank Gusenberg, Moran's enforcer, still alive, but he refused to say who had been involved. I've read accounts that say he said cops did it, and another account saying he was asked at the hospital who shot him, and his response was, "No one." But Bugs Moran had an idea of who it was and said, "Only Capone kills like that." Capone himself was not in Chicago at the time. He was in Florida overseeing his dog track business there, and that gave him an ironclad alibi. But I'm pretty sure Capone was probably capable of hiring people to do his dirty work for him. Though no one was ever arrested or tried for the crimes due to the lack of evidence, the massacre was eventually accredited to Capone and his gang. The massacre led to Moran being less of a figurehead in the Chicago gang circuit, and left Capone to completely rule Chicago until he was arrested for tax evasion in 1931. As far as evidence, there was a Capone associate who was in a car accident that killed a police officer in December 1929. He escaped, but police discovered guns in his home that were used in the massacre. Another associate of Capone's claimed he was the lookout that day who accidentally mistook Al Weinshank for Moran. In 2009, the Cadillac that was on the scene was found walled up in a Detroit garage. Not everyone thought Capone was to blame, though. Because 2 of the shooters were dressed as police, and the fact that Gusenberg allegedly said cops did it, is it possible that it's that simple that cops were involved? Apparently Moran had stolen bootleg liquor from a crooked cop, and it's a possibility the massacre was in retaliation of that. There was also another gang based in Detroit called the Purple Gang that had ties to Capone. There was a theory that the Gusenberg brothers were the target because they had killed a young firefighter, and possibly his family wanted revenge. And others thought maybe Bugs Moran himself planned the hit because he was getting annoyed with the Gusenberg brothers. But still, everything always pointed back to Capone. This massacre marked the beginning of the end of the Wild West type period going on in Chicago, and police started cracking down on gang crimes. Capone was eventually arrested first on a concealed weapons charge, and again on tax evasion. When he was finally released from prison, he was in poor health and poor mental state due to the advanced stages of syphilis. Capone died in 1947, and the St. Valentine's Day massacre remains unsolved. But our story isn't over yet. I don't think it's possible to have so much bloodshed in one location and not have it leave some sort of energy behind. The SMC Cartage Company at 2122 North Clark Street the building where the massacre happened, housed 2 more businesses in the years after, but people were drawn to the scene, and the building was eventually torn down in 1967. When the building came down, the bricks became collector's items, especially if they had blood on them or bullet holes. A businessman by the name of George Patey purchased the bricks. In fact, he purchased the entire wall where the men were standing when they were gunned down. He first took the bricks on tour and tried to open a crime museum, but that didn't pan out, so he reassembled the garage wall in the men's room of his Banjo Palace nightclub in Vancouver, British Columbia. With the addition of a plastic screen set up in front of the bricks became a urinal wall with conveniently placed targets where men were supposed to aim their urine. I don't even have words. The nightclub eventually went out of business, and the bricks were auctioned off for $1,000 each. But the people who bought them started bringing them back, claiming they were cursed. Some people reported that they were being haunted, some were getting into terrible accidents, suffering financial ruin, or getting horribly sick. Eventually, the bricks were purchased by the Las Vegas Mob Museum. There are a total of 300 bricks on display there at the museum. In the Mob Museum, they report hearing the sounds of gunshots and men moaning and falling to the ground. Some who have visited the bricks say the wall radiates negative, uncomfortable energy. Back in Chicago, in the 4-story Greystone at 2120 North Clark Street, the building that was next to the garage, the owner reports a lot of poltergeist activity. Things fly off the counters and items fall from the shelves. In the lot where the garage stood, there are many different phenomena that are experienced. Some see unusual lights on the property. They hear male voices, and like the Mob Museum in Vegas, there are the sounds of gunfire and men screaming. People say there's a sense of fear there on the property, and animals, particularly dogs, seem to fear going near the area. There's some speculation that has something to do with the energy from the German Shepherd named Highball, who was there at the time of the massacre. But the biggest haunting associated with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre is the haunting of Al Capone. And I don't mean Capone's ghost, but the ghost that actually haunted him. In May of 1929, Capone was arrested for a weapons charge and eventually found himself incarcerated in Pennsylvania's Eastern State Penitentiary. The warden there made sure Al Capone had all the comforts he needed: a private furnished cell with rugs, lamps, a double bed, bookshelves, photos, and a $500 console radio. He was allowed to make long-distance calls from the warden's office and have visitors outside of the typical visiting hours. Capone was considered cheery and accommodating, except at night when the lights went out. It was at Eastern State Penitentiary that Al Scarface Capone began being haunted by the ghost of Jimmy Clark, who was killed in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Jimmy Clark was the brother-in-law of George Bugs Moran and considered a hardened killer, and he tormented Al Capone at night, or rather his ghost did. Guards and inmates would hear Capone scream in the night, begging Jimmy to go away and leave him alone. Other times he could be heard having a conversation with someone. No one had any idea who he was talking to, since he was alone in his cell, and during the day, Capone refused to talk about it. When he was released from prison and returned to Chicago, the haunting continued. He spoke often about the ghost and his curse, and even ended up hiring psychic Alice Britt to try to get rid of the spirit named Jimmy, but not surprisingly, it didn't work. One day, Capone's valet claimed he saw a tall man standing by the window of Capone's room. When he questioned this man, the man slipped behind the curtain and disappeared. The room was searched, but no one was found. Capone insisted it was Jimmy. When Al Capone ended up in Alcatraz, the ghost of Jimmy went with him. He would again wake up screaming, and guards would rush to his cell to help him, only to find nothing and no one there. Al Capone continued to be haunted by the spirit of Jimmy until he died. There are some who say Jimmy was just a hallucination of a syphilis-riddled brain, but Jimmy showed up before Capone started to show serious signs of syphilis. And what about the man his valet saw? I guess we'll never really know if Capone was haunted by a ghost or syphilis. How many times can I say syphilis in one episode? Nothing like talking about syphilis before Valentine's Day. And on that note, that's going to do it for this episode. Remember, hanging out with gangs and mobsters gets you killed. And use protection, because if you get syphilis, you'll get so sick you won't be able to tell if you're haunted or crazy. You can find Lurk wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, or always at lurkpodcast.com. On the website, you'll find episodes as well as links to our social media accounts. Please consider following us. Don't forget, we have merch at lurkpodcastmerch.com. And if you have a moment and enjoy the show, please consider giving us a 5-star review. And until next time, keep lurking.